They said the name came from a prospector who died of thirst there, but I knew better. Desolation Point was never meant to have a name at all. When the production first reached out, I almost said no. I'd been hired before as a cultural consultant, which in Hollywood meant a token with a business card. They wanted the veneer of respect, not the substance of it. But this time, the offer was too good. A month of steady pay, a big studio, a credit that might actually get me in the door for better work. So I said yes, and I wish I hadn't. Desolation Point lay deep within Navajo Nation land. Past the paved roads, beyond even the dusty trading post towns, where the cliffs cut sharp against the horizon, and nothing moved but wind and vultures. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound, the kind where you felt watched even when you were alone. The first time I saw it, I understood why my great-grandfather called it Nilch'e Dah, the place where the wind remembers. There was a hum in the air, like the land itself was breathing. The cliffs rose in layers of ochre and bone, streaked with old soot. Every sound echoed too long. Every shadow lasted too late. Sebastian Crow, the director, stepped out of his air-conditioned SUV with his sunglasses and his scarf. Perfect. God left this place unfinished so we could film here. He smiled like he'd just discovered a new religion. I told him softly that the canyon wasn't right, that it wasn't ours to use, that the old ones warned against lingering there after sunset, that even the animals avoided it. He laughed. "Come on, JC. It's a desert. What's going to get us? Sand." He clapped me on the back and walked toward the wooden facades they were building for the film's Wild West town. They called it Deadwood Reborn, a Western horror hybrid, ironic as hell, about cowboys fighting ancient curses. The irony didn't last long. By the second day, the crew trailers had formed a tight little village near the base of the mesa. Generators hummed, cables snaked through red dirt, and everyone treated the land like a backdrop, not a place with bones beneath it. At night, the cliffs seemed to move. I'd step outside my trailer and see something glinting between the ridges, like pale eyes reflecting the work lights. The locals hired for background work didn't stay after dark. They packed up before sundown, muttering prayers as they left. The production coordinator complained it was bad for morale. When I told Sebastian that the area was forbidden, he waved me off again. "We're making art, not anthropology." Then he looked out over the canyon like it belonged to him. "Besides, if it was dangerous, your people would have built a Walmart here by now." That was the moment I knew he wouldn't listen. The crew started calling the place Ghost Gulch. They joked about hearing footsteps in the dust, seeing figures in the desert. That night, I stood outside the trailers watching the cliffs. The air was still, too still. Then, from somewhere deep in the valley, I heard it. A low guttural laugh, carried on a wind that hadn't been there a moment ago. And behind it, something else. A whisper, almost human. "You brought them here." By the third morning, the assistant director's dog was gone. Its leash was still tied to the trailer handle, but the dirt around it was blackened, as if something burning had passed through. No one laughed about Ghost Gulch after that. Desolation Point, the land itself felt restless. The heat came down in hard glassy waves that made the air shimmer. Every step left a ghost print in the red dust. I'd begun to notice how the echoes here carried too far, how voices from one end of the set seemed to linger seconds longer than they should, as if something unseen was repeating them softly, just out of sync. We were shooting the first scene that day, a simple establishing shot of the main street of the fake town. Nothing supernatural, nothing complicated. Just 3 actors walking down the dusty street while the camera tracked them from a dolly. The sound crew perched behind a boom mic at the edge of the facades. I stayed nearby, mostly to observe, to make sure no props or costumes crossed into offensive territory. That was what they paid me for. Quiet observation, polite nods. The first take went fine. The second didn't. The scene started like before. Boots crunching on grit, wind slipping through the fake storefronts. Then, halfway through, the sound tech, a guy named Andy, frowned and took off his headphones. "Hold up," he said. "You hear that?" Sebastian groaned. "Hear what?" Andy rewound the take on his recorder. his face pale beneath his ball cap. There it was, faint at first, buried under the sound of footsteps and wind, then unmistakable, a whisper. It wasn't English, it wasn't wind. It was a voice speaking my language. I stepped closer, my chest tightening. The syllables were clear, heavy with old resonance, drawn out the way elders used to speak when they recited prayers. The voice said, "Only the guilty remain among the ashes." I hadn't heard that dialect in years. Old ceremonial phrasing, almost extinct. My grandmother had used it once when she warned me about the Skinwalkers near Shiprock Mesa. Sebastian folded his arms. "Probably some freak radio bleed from a trucker," he said. I shook my head. "There's no signal out here. Nothing that clear." He looked at me with that smirk of his. "JC, if you want to sell the crew on spooky folklore, do it at the campfire, not during my shot." Andy didn't laugh. He just took off his headphones and set them down like they were hot. "Man, that wasn't radio. That was right next to the mic. Like someone was standing here." We turned to look around. The set was empty except for the actors, who were resetting for another take. No one stood near the boom pole. No one could have whispered that close. The wind picked up suddenly, dry and sour, like it had swept through something long dead. I felt a weight settle in the pit of my stomach. The feeling of being watched, of old eyes behind the sun glare. Sebastian rolled his eyes. "Reset. Let's go again." They did the scene 2 more times, and both times the whisper came back. Each take, the words were different, but the rhythm was the same. Ritual cadence, low, warning. The 3rd time, I caught the word child, followed by something that made my throat tighten. "I am still among you." When I translated it quietly to myself, the sound tech overheard and went pale. "You mean someone's." "Enough," Sebastian snapped. "We'll clean it in post." He stormed off toward the camera crew, barking orders, pretending not to notice that everyone else had gone silent. I stayed by the sound tent long after the others wandered away. Andy handed me the recorder and said, "If that's radio interference, I'll eat my mic." When I replayed the audio through the headphones, the whisper didn't sound human anymore. The words bled together, slower, almost dragging across the speakers, like fire licking old wood. And then something else layered beneath it, a faint, rhythmic scraping. At night, the desert was colder than I expected, and the wind that slid between the trailers carried that same dragging noise, distant but deliberate. I stepped outside and looked toward the cliffs. Something moved up there, tall, thin, hunched, the shape of a man maybe, but it shimmered faintly orange, as if lit from within. The next morning, the sound tent burned down. The crew found it smoldering just after dawn. The recorder melted into its stand. They called it an electrical short, but there were no cables nearby. And in the ash, when the sun rose, I saw something pressed into the dirt. A print, deep and charred, like a bare human foot that had walked through flame. After that, the burn marks stopped being isolated. Every morning when I walked the perimeter, clipboard in hand, I saw more of them. Half-moon shapes of scorched dirt, as though someone had pressed glowing feet into the sand and walked barefoot through the set. They curved behind the saloon facade, crossed the mock sheriff's office, and led toward the ridge behind the trailers, straight toward the cliffs of Desolation Point. It wasn't just a few prints anymore. It was a path, a trail of blackened impressions winding toward the rock face. When I crouched down to study them, the soil still smelled faintly of ash, even though it hadn't rained, and there'd been no open flames on set since the sound tent burned down. Sebastian told us they'd resume shooting. "We can't afford delays," he said, pacing with his hands behind his back. "We're not going to let desert ghost stories cost us another day." But by then, the crew had already started whispering. The actors claimed they heard movement around the facades at night. Soft steps pacing the fake boardwalks long after filming ended, slow and deliberate. The grip team swore their floodlights flickered whenever they pointed them toward the cliffs. And Andy, the sound tech who'd caught the whisper, had stopped speaking to anyone at all. He sat in the mess tent, hands trembling, headphones hanging around his neck like a noose. The desert had a pulse, I swear it. A strange hush would fall over the camp around midnight, and then, faintly like a breath inside a cave, I heard it, whispering, dozens of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking a language I barely recognized. Ancient Navajo, older than any dialect my grandparents spoke. I stepped outside my trailer, wrapped in a blanket, and stared at the cliffs. The moonlight traced pale silver across the rock. And there, high up on the ridge, stood 3 silhouettes, still human-shaped. At first, I thought they were crew members, maybe the security team, but they didn't move. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, staring down toward the set. When I blinked, they were gone. The next morning, the actors began to complain. Not about the heat, not about Sebastian's temper, about their stand-ins. There's something wrong with them. One of the leads, a woman named Marla, told me. Every time we break, I see my stand-in standing up there on the cliffs, watching me, not moving. I frowned. Maybe it's just someone else from the crew. She shook her head violently. No, it's me, JC. She's wearing my costume, my hat, the same tear in the sleeve I got yesterday. And when I look up, she's already staring back, like she knows I'm looking. She wasn't the only one. 2 more actors said the same thing later that day, each of them seeing their doubles, standing motionless on the ridge. When I told the assistant director, he checked the log sheet. Every stand-in was accounted for in base camp at those times. No one had left the trailers. By evening, tension was eating through the crew. People started skipping meals. Some locked themselves in their trailers after dark. Sebastian told them it was all collective paranoia from working in isolation. You're letting this place get in your heads, he said. You're all storytellers. That's your curse. But I noticed he'd started carrying a flask of whiskey around his neck. His hands shook when he lit his cigarettes. I hiked out toward the ridge to see for myself. The air up there was thinner, cooler. The rocks gave off a faint smell, something like burnt copper. The ground was littered with ash in strange circular patches, almost like someone had built small fires and then snuffed them out by hand. I followed the burn marks up a narrow incline and came to a flat ledge overlooking the entire set. From here, the fake town looked like a toy village abandoned in the sand. And there, between the rock shadows, I saw shapes moving. They weren't crew, they weren't animals. They looked like the actors, but wrong. Stiff, shimmering faintly as if lit by an inner ember. When the wind shifted, I caught the faintest smell of singed fabric and blood. They turned their heads in perfect unison. Every one of them looked at me. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to run. The ground beneath my boots was still warm. When I returned to camp, it was just past midnight. From the valley behind me came a sound that froze my blood. A long, low moan, like something half-human calling out through the canyon. Then the echo of my own name, drawn out and whispered from every direction. JC. In the morning, one of the actors was missing. We split into search teams at dawn. The desert was still cold, the horizon painted in dull grays that looked like bruises on the earth. I joined 2 crew members, Andy and Marla, both of them exhausted but eager to prove themselves useful. The missing actor, Trent Hollis, had wandered off after the shoot wrapped the night before. They said he was method acting, trying to get into character. But no one had seen him since sunset, and by morning, even Sebastian started to look uneasy. The air felt wrong that day, not just heavy, but awake. The sand crunched under our boots like it didn't want to be stepped on. The further we walked from the fake town, the quieter it got, until even the radio static faded. The cliffs loomed higher ahead, jagged and sunburned like open teeth. I could feel something watching from those ridges. Not eyes exactly, more like the land itself was holding its breath. Jesus, Marla muttered, pointing to the ground near a cluster of sagebrush. Burned animal remains. Small curled rabbits and prairie dogs, scattered in a rough circle. Charred black, but the sand beneath them wasn't scorched, as if the fire had come from inside. Andy gagged. Coyote attack, maybe? I crouched beside one of the bodies. No, coyotes don't burn what they kill. We kept walking until we heard a noise. a soft shuffle just ahead. When we rounded a rock outcropping, Trent was standing there. Shirt torn, hair full of grit, eyes locked on us. "Trent?" Marla ran up to him, but he didn't move. He didn't blink. "Where the hell have you been?" Andy said, panting. "I got lost," Trent answered, voice calm. Too calm. His lips were cracked, but he didn't look dehydrated. In fact, his skin had a strange sheen, like oil catching sunlight. I stepped closer, and he turned to me. That's when I saw it. That gleam. His pupils weren't round anymore, not fully. There was a shimmer, a flicker that reminded me of heat distortion. "Did you hear anything out there?" I asked quietly, switching to Navajo without thinking. He stared at me, blank. Then, almost mechanically, he tilted his head and said, "Yes," in perfect Navajo. But his accent was wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. Marla was already calling on the walkie, telling base camp they'd found him. I didn't move. Something about Trent's smell made the back of my throat burn, like scorched hair and wet earth. When we led him back toward camp, he kept glancing at the cliffs. Every few minutes, his mouth twitched like he was trying to smile but couldn't remember how. After he was checked out by the medic and cleared to rest, I sat alone behind the catering trailer, staring toward the black silhouette of the mesas. A flicker of light danced briefly along the ridge. A spark, like matches being struck in the dark. I whispered a quiet prayer, one my grandmother taught me when I was little. But even as I said the words, I could feel something listening back. And somewhere behind me, in one of the trailers, Trent laughed. Soft, wrong, like he was trying out a new voice. By the middle of the second week, everyone looked exhausted. Sunburnt, short-tempered, jumpy. No one wanted to say it out loud, but something wasn't right anymore. The wind had shifted. It came screaming down the valley in long moaning breaths that rattled the plywood saloon fronts and sent dust spiraling across the fake main street. Sebastian insisted the show must go on. "We're losing daylight every goddamn day," he shouted during breakfast, slamming his metal coffee mug against the catering table. He looked like a man trying to intimidate his own fear into submission. No more delays. But there were delays. There were always delays now. Around mid-morning, I was called to the prop tent. The prop master, a quiet guy named Ruiz, stood staring down at an open trunk with his hands shaking. "You need to see this," he said. "Inside, where the period-accurate rifles should have been, lay 6 tomahawks. Not the rubber ones we used for stunts. Real ones, old ones. Their blades were nicked and dark with age. The handles wrapped in what looked like leather but wasn't. My stomach turned when I noticed the texture. Skin? Too smooth, too fine. These weren't here yesterday," Ruiz muttered. "I locked up everything before we wrapped. The rest of the weapons were gone. Even the blanks and ammo belts had vanished. Someone had traded them, I could feel it. The same way you feel the heat coming off a fire before you see the flames. Did anyone come through here last night?" I asked. "Only security," he hesitated. "And Trent said he wanted to get a feel for the props again." Trent. I found him sitting near the mess tent, alone, staring at his reflection in a tin plate, like he was studying it for imperfections. He didn't look up when I approached. "You were near the prop tent last night," I said. He didn't answer, just ran his finger along the edge of the plate. "We should be using the real thing," he murmured. "For authenticity. That's not your call." He smiled then, that same half-formed, not quite human smile. "It's not yours either, consultant." The way he said the word made my skin crawl. I crouched beside him, lowering my voice. "You need to listen to me. You went somewhere you shouldn't have, and something followed you back." He looked at me finally, and for a second his face shifted. Just a flicker, like something else was underneath his skin, pressing outward. He blinked slowly and said, "You talk too much, JC." Later that day, I went out past the trailers, following the fire marks I'd noticed earlier. Those black streaks on stone that no one else seemed to care about. They led straight toward the northern cliffs. When I reached the base of the nearest mesa, I found something waiting for me. One of the missing prop rifles, wedged upright in the sand, barrel pointing skyward. Its wood was blackened and splintered. Next to it lay a small pile of ash, perfectly circular. The ground around it smelled like copper and sage, the smell of ritual. And beneath that, carved into the stone wall, were symbols I hadn't seen since childhood. Old ones, forbidden ones. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. The cliffs seemed to hum faintly, like a throat preparing to speak. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low. The set looked wrong in the half-light, less like a western town and more like a graveyard made of wood and lies. Sebastian was pacing, barking orders, telling everyone to ignore the bullshit. He didn't see what I saw. Trent standing at the edge of the lot, staring at the cliffs again, his mouth silently moving as if repeating something whispered into his ear. The next night, they'd finished shooting early, a rarity under Sebastian's tyrannical schedule, and most of the crew had retreated to their trailers. But one actor stayed behind, Marcus Heller, the film's lead, the kind of guy who'd tell you about his process before you even asked. He'd been drinking from a flask since sunset, mumbling about living in the character's skin. I didn't know him well, but I respected how seriously he took the work. He'd cornered me a few times to ask about the real history of the Navajo. The wars, the legends, the curses. He'd written it all down in a little notebook that he kept in his pocket. That night, he was supposed to be off duty. But around 1 a.m., people in the nearby trailers reported hearing Marcus talking to someone. Then came laughter, 2 voices. Except Marcus was alone. According to the production logs later, his door opened at 1:14 a.m. He stepped outside, barefoot, wearing only jeans and a torn undershirt. He was smiling. The kind of dazed, trusting smile you give when someone you love is calling your name. "Marcus," the voice had said, clear as daylight, female and familiar. It was his co-star, Nina. But Nina was asleep in her trailer across the lot. I know that for a fact. She shared the one next to mine, and I heard her snoring that night through the thin metal walls. Marcus walked toward the set, following that voice. It led him down the makeshift street of Desolation Point, past the blacksmith shop, the brothel, the saloon, until he reached the heart of the town square. That's where they found his footprints later, crisp and deep in the sand. At the time, no one knew what was happening. The cameras weren't rolling, but the security lights were still on. That's probably what saved us from not believing the next part. Because several people, including 2 grips and a lighting tech, swore they saw what he saw. A figure stood in the middle of the street. It was tall, taller than any of us, draped in a full wolfskin costume from the prop truck. At least that's what they thought at first. It hung off the figure's shoulders in ragged strips, the fur dark and matted with what might have been mud or blood. Its hands dangled wrong, too long, fingers bent backward like antlers. The thing didn't move when Marcus approached. It just stood there, head slightly tilted. "Hey!" Marcus called, still grinning, his voice cracking just a little. "You're early for call time, huh?" The thing spoke. It used Nina's voice again, soft, teasing, exactly like her. "You said you wanted to practice. Come closer." One of the grips said. Marcus took another step forward, then another. When he was close enough to reach out, the thing lifted its head. Its face, what little they could see, was wrong. The skin looked stretched, the eyes wet and empty, like they'd been pressed in from behind. It grinned with yellow teeth. "Closer," it whispered. Marcus froze. For a second, you could see his instincts fighting the spell. His body stiff, his breath caught. Then something changed in his eyes. They went glassy, the way people's do when the fear gives up. And then the lights went out. All at once. The entire camp went black. The crew ran out, stumbling with flashlights, shouting names. I grabbed mine and sprinted toward the set. When we reached the square, the figure was gone. The only thing left was Marcus, standing alone, staring at the empty sky. His skin was pale, and there were scratches across his chest, like claw marks. He didn't remember a thing. Said he'd gone out because he heard someone calling. When we showed him the wolfskin costume from the prop truck the next morning, he swore he'd never touched it. But the fur smelled of smoke. And when Ruiz, the prop master, inspected the rack, he found that every costume tag had been burned away, as if someone didn't want us to know which one it was. After the night Marcus wandered off, some packed their gear early, others slept with the lights on. But Sebastian Crow was unfazed. He brushed off the incident with his trademark arrogance, saying, "Fear makes great art. Keep the fear." 2 days later, 3 more actors vanished. It started with Nina. She was supposed to shoot a sunrise monologue, but when the assistant director went to fetch her, her trailer door was open, her boots were still on the step. The makeup chair was empty. A faint trail of sand led out toward the cliffs. A few hours later, 2 more were gone. Both supporting actors, both last seen near the mess tent around 3 a.m. Their radios were dead. Their cars were still parked. Sebastian insisted that there was no need to look for them. He recalled a similar disappearance by Trent, who was simply seeking inspiration. They were gone from sunrise to sunset, 12 hours. And then, just before dusk, they came walking down the dirt road toward camp. Side by side, their clothes dusty, faces blank. Everyone cheered, relieved. But when I saw them, I stopped cold. There was something off in the way they moved. It wasn't exhaustion. It was rhythm. Too smooth, too synchronized, as if they were walking to the same silent beat. Their eyes didn't scan the faces greeting them. They stared past us, fixed on something invisible beyond the set. When I stepped close to Nina, she turned her head toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate. "Where were you?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "We went to find the story." "The what?" Her smile widened too far. "You'll see it soon." The others laughed when she said it, but not the way you laugh at a joke. It was an empty, echoing sound, all in unison. The next morning, filming resumed. Sebastian was ecstatic, said the trio's energy was perfect now. "See? A little wilderness in their veins," he said, waving his cigarette like a conductor's baton. But what I saw chilled me. In the scene they shot, a tense exchange between townsfolk before a hanging. Their acting had changed completely. Before, they'd been stiff, hollow. Now their performances were raw, unsettlingly real. When Nina wept on cue, her tears were black with dust. When Marcus screamed, it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a real man dying. Even the camera operators said the footage looked strange. Under the sun, their eyes reflected light, like an animal's. A faint yellow gleam that pulsed when they blinked. When I mentioned it to the cinematographer, he brushed it off. "Lens flare," he said, but his hands shook when he adjusted the filter. When I tried to talk to them offset, all 3 ignored me. They sat outside their trailers long after dark, unmoving, staring toward the cliffs. Their radios were silent. When the wind shifted, I could smell smoke again and something else. Something metallic, like old blood baking on stone. Later that night, I found the footprints leading out beyond the trailers. Barefoot and clawed, pressed deep into the dust. On the ridge across from me, 4 figures stood. They looked like people at first, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the set. But the longer I stared, the less human they seemed. One was hunched, one impossibly tall, their outlines rippling like heat haze. The wind moved their clothes. One of them lifted a hand and waved, a mockery of a greeting. By the end of the 3rd week, Desolation Point felt like it was dying by degrees. The radios popped and hissed with a strange distortion that sometimes almost sounded like speech. The cameras malfunctioned. Lenses fogged over in the open desert heat. Batteries drained twice as fast. And when the boom mics picked up sound, it came with faint undertones. Whispering, chanting, sometimes laughter that didn't belong to anyone near the set. Sebastian, of course, said it was environmental interference. He said the desert heat played tricks with the signals. He ordered everyone to stop talking about it, especially online. "No production leaks," he barked during one of his daily rants. But it wasn't just the equipment. The valley itself had changed. One morning, I woke to the sound of shouting outside the trailer village. Two of the drivers were standing by the transport lot, staring at what was left of the vehicles. Every single car and truck in camp had been tampered with. Not vandalized exactly, but altered. The tires weren't slashed. They'd been cut clean, as if with surgical precision. Engine wires had been pulled out in neat handfuls. The steering wheels were smeared with fine gray ash. And worse, clawed handprints were pressed into the dust on the windshields. Chris, one of the grips, swore he'd seen figures moving around camp the night before. Thought it was the extras messing around. He told me, rubbing the back of his neck, but they didn't move right, kinda like shadows swimming through air. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was locals trying to scare the crew off. Others whispered about skinwalkers, but only when Sebastian wasn't around. Half the crew refused to sleep. They gathered in the mess tent, wrapped in blankets, drinking cheap beer under the hum of the generator. The light flickered every few seconds, like a heartbeat stuttering. Someone played music on a phone, just to fill the silence, but halfway through, the music warped. The singer's voice bent into a long guttural sound, and then the lyrics changed. Not words, just a rasping rhythmic chant in that same old dialect I'd heard through the boom mic weeks before. When I snatched the phone and killed the audio, the silence afterward felt alive. And then, from the cliffs beyond camp, something called back. It was distant, but clear enough that every head turned at once. A voice, almost human, echoing the same phrase from the phone. Sebastian posted a security schedule, demanded professionalism, and went to sleep like nothing happened. But I couldn't. I sat outside my trailer until near dawn, staring toward the dark mesas, listening. By the next morning, the caterer refused to serve food until the crew blessed the camp. The assistant director had packed her bags and was threatening to hike out on foot. The extras wouldn't go near the fake town at all. Said they saw people walking between the buildings when no one was there. And through all of it, Sebastian only grew calmer, almost serene. He carried his camera everywhere, shooting behind-the-scenes footage with his own hands. "You can feel it, can't you?" he said, smiling faintly, as he framed a shot of the cliffs. "The place wants to be filmed. It's giving us everything." The horizon, once vast and golden, now seemed to bend inward, as if the land itself was watching. I had reached my breaking point. I had begun marking symbols in the dirt near my tent, old warding marks my grandmother had taught him. But even those seemed to fade by morning, as if something had come in the night to wipe them away. I found Sebastian inside the director's tent, hunched over the monitors, replaying the same scene over and over. The one they'd shot the days before, the Revenant ambush, as Sebastian called it. The footage flickered and warped, but the director didn't seem to notice. His eyes were glassy, his lips moving silently as if he were reciting something. "Sebastian," I said. My voice was dry, shaking. "We have to stop. Something's wrong here. This isn't a normal place." Sebastian didn't look up. "You're just tired, JC. We all are." I stepped closer, slamming my hand down on the table. "No, you don't understand. This land doesn't want us here. Those marks we've been seeing, those voices on the recordings, the way people are changing. It's all connected." Finally, Sebastian turned to face me. His face was pale in the low light, but his eyes glowed with feverish excitement. "You're saying it's real?" he whispered. "Then we've captured something no one else ever has." I recoiled. "You don't get it. These aren't ghosts or movie effects. They're skinwalkers. People who broke the old laws, who gave up their humanity. They're not supposed to be seen, not supposed to be spoken of. And we've dragged cameras and lights into their home." Sebastian laughed. It wasn't his usual confident laugh. "You think I'm going to stop filming because of your desert ghost stories? This is my masterpiece." He shook his head, jaw tightening. "Get out. You're fired. I'm done with your superstitious nonsense. You've been undermining me since day one. You're dooming everyone here," I said quietly. Sebastian laughed. "I'm making the best movie in the history of cinema." I walked away to my trailer. Sebastian called out to the crew, "Everyone get ready. We're shooting the final scene at dusk." I should have driven out the second Sebastian fired me. But my car, like others, was damaged by someone. Every hose was cut. Every wire pulled loose like something had chewed through it. Engine blackened as if from lightning. So I stayed. Not by choice, but because there was nowhere to go. The cliffs glowed faintly red, though there was no fire. The air was sharp with ozone and smoke. I could feel something humming beneath my feet, like the earth itself was waiting. From where I stood, half hidden among the trailers at the edge of the fake frontier town, I could see Sebastian setting up his final scene. He was radiant with purpose, barking orders, waving his arms, desperate for the grand finale he'd been chasing since the first day. "This is it," he shouted to the remaining crew. "The massacre. Raw, real, desperate. No cuts, no retakes. I want blood, confusion, panic." He didn't know what he was asking for. The actors were already in costume, but I could see the difference in them. The four who'd come back from the desert days ago. They moved differently. They breathed differently, their heads tilting in unison toward the cliffs every few minutes, as if listening for something the rest of US couldn't hear. The cameras started rolling. The scene began. Horses screaming, gunfire echoing through the valley, smoke machines spitting gray clouds into the wind. For a few moments, it actually looked like the chaos Sebastian wanted. And then, the sounds changed. The screams weren't acting anymore. I saw the first one drop. A stuntman, throat torn open, his fake blood replaced by something real and crimson. One of the actors bent over him, moving too fast to be human. And when he lifted his face again, his jaw was stretched wider than any human jaw should go. Sebastian screamed at them to cut, to stop, but they didn't even look at him. They kept going. The guns went silent one by one as people ran, stumbled, fell. Cameras toppled. The cinematographer was dragged screaming through the dust toward the cliffs, her voice cut short mid-breath. I backed away slowly, praying not to be seen. The whole valley had erupted into something primal. Howls echoing off the rocks, the sound of tearing flesh and breaking wood. Firelight flickered across the fake saloon, and in that light, I saw shapes moving. Half men, half something else, their bodies stretching and collapsing in ways that made no sense. Sebastian stood in the middle of it all, his face frozen in unspeakable horror. Then one of the skinwalkers turned toward him. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I ran until the screams behind me faded into wind, until the glow of the set was just a distant pulse on the horizon. The desert was pitch black, the stars smeared by dust and heat. Every shadow looked like it could stand up and start walking. I didn't dare use a flashlight. Something was following me. I could feel it. The sand shifted behind me in long rhythmic strides. I thought about the stories my grandmother used to tell, about the ones who wore the skins of beasts, who could hunt by name or scent. I didn't know if I'd make it to the highway. I just knew I couldn't stop. Somewhere far behind me, the valley screamed again. Hundreds of voices, human and not, all howling in unison. A faint column of smoke twisted up from the fake town, curling like a spirit toward the rising sun. But the color of it wasn't right. It was a reddish-brown, thick as old blood. The sun came up like a wound, bleeding over the ridges in the east. I'd been walking all night, stumbling across sand and shale, my throat raw from breathing the dust. Every step felt like dragging myself out of a dream that didn't want to let me go. When the light reached the valley behind me, I kept walking. The mesas in the distance shimmered like ghosts. My water was gone by sunrise and my phone was dead. The silence pressed down on me so heavy I began to crave any sound at all, until I realized I wasn't alone. It started with footsteps, not loud ones, just faint crunches in the sand behind me. I turned, expecting nothing, and saw the shimmer of heat, a ripple in the air that bent the horizon. When I stopped, it stopped. When I started again, it followed. "Go back," I whispered in Navajo, not sure who I was talking to. "You've had enough." The air trembled. I kept moving, trying not to look back. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning through the last of the morning haze. My legs ached, my vision tunneled. That was when I heard the voice, "JC." My name, carried softly on the wind. The same voice that had whispered through the boom mic days ago. Calm, familiar, ancient. I turned around and saw nothing. Only the desert, open and wide. But I felt the weight of eyes on me, the kind that don't blink, that never tire. I started to move quickly. The desert blurred around me. My body moved on instinct, fueled by pure terror and the knowledge that if I fell, if I looked back again, something would be there waiting. Something that wore the faces of my colleagues. At that moment, I saw a shimmer of movement on the horizon. Dust rising, a car. I stumbled toward it, waving both arms, half crying, half laughing. The driver was a middle-aged man in a pickup, hauling water tanks in the bed. He hit the brakes, eyes wide when he saw me. "Jesus, you all right?" he asked, helping me into the passenger seat. I couldn't answer. I just sat there, trembling, staring back at the valley as it shrank in the rearview mirror. The smoke had faded now. Only the cliffs remained, silent and unbroken, as if nothing had ever happened. But when the driver turned the truck toward the highway, I saw movement in the mirror. Just a flicker. A figure standing at the edge of the road where I'd been moments ago. It looked almost like me. Same build, same clothes, same stance. Only the eyes were wrong. They glowed faintly amber, catching the morning light like an animal's. I blinked, and it was gone. It's been 6 weeks since Desolation Point. 6 weeks since the official reports called it a catastrophic onset accident. A propane leak, they said. A chain of explosions that killed almost everyone instantly. No foul play, no survivors except me. They called me a lucky consultant. I didn't correct them. The investigators came once, asked their questions, and left uneasy. They didn't like how quiet I was, how little I said. They wanted clean answers, cause and effect, a story that fit into paperwork. But how do you tell them the land itself turned against us? How do you explain what wears human faces, what walks under a different sky? I came back home to the reservation, to my grandmother's old trailer. She doesn't ask questions anymore. She just burns cedar every night and prays under her breath. The old way, the way that doesn't translate well into English. I help her sometimes, but I don't join in. I think maybe I brought something with me, and I don't want it following her too. For a while, I tried to sleep through the nights. I fixed fences, visited neighbors, did small work. Everyone treats me gently now, like I'm half gone already. But the desert doesn't forget. Some nights, when the wind comes down from the cliffs, I hear the boom mics again. The static, the whisper threading through the white noise. Always the same voice, patient, too close. Sometimes I catch a word or two in the old dialect, the one no one speaks anymore. Once, I swear I heard it say my name. The strangest thing happened 3 nights ago. A USB drive arrived in the mail, no note, no return address. Curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one file. No metadata, no timestamp. Just a single clip. Grainy, distorted. It was footage from the final scene. The camera shakes and stumbles through dust and flame. Sebastian is screaming for the actors to keep going, for the camera to stay steady. The sound is warped, stretched, almost metallic. Then, through the static, the frame tilts, and I see them. The 4 skinwalkers, their faces melting and reforming like wax. Their movements stuttering between human and animal. The camera keeps rolling until it falls, until the last shot is the sky over the valley turning dark, as if the sun itself were closing its eyes. And at the very end, one of them bends toward the lens. The face shifts, then lands on mine. The file ends. I tried to delete it. The drive reappeared the next morning on my porch. Now, when I go outside before dawn, I sometimes see footprints circling the trailer. I keep my grandmother's prayers going, the cedar smoke rising thin into the air. I whisper the old protection songs, though my voice shakes. The story didn't end in Desolation Point. The Skinwalkers want me to join my dead colleagues.